Alright, good morning, this is Ben. I wanted to respond to video Evidence that God does not exist by Atheist Liberty. So that's evidence that God does not exist by Atheist Liberty. And starts out, just gives a explanation of Occam's razor, given two explanations. The simpler one is more likely to be true. I don't know if he said is true or more likely. I think he understood it's just more likely because sometimes more complicated explanations are actually the real explanation. Sometimes complicated things, do happen when simpler things could have happened. He gave an example of, ghost opening the garage door, or maybe I just didn't shut it all the way. A lot of things. For example, the metal could have just gotten weak. Maybe that's even simpler, but let's see. He gives an example of prayer, and people, pray and they think, the thoughts in their head must come from God, or they'll pray for a message from God, and like the next thing the preacher says, or just something they hear. And I would agree with him that there's a mistake that can arise here, that we think that, we set up the system where whatever we hear, next is a message from God, and what that is an assumption that's built in ahead of time. But, you know what you say, and you know if someone else says something, or if it comes from some other unknown source. And so what we would have to do is introduce some sort of tool for judging the truthfulness. Anyway, so he says, how could we know, or how would we know God exists? Well, there are some good reasons, but we won't go into those. We'll just go with the starter. He says, because he says, I don't know, but at least the Bible ought to be true. And he says the first few verses, and we see that the Bible's, as he said, patently false. He seemed to allow that maybe it wasn't, well, he's talking about Genesis, and it's disagreement with, I guess, natural history and science. And he says, so if Genesis is lying to you, the only way you can believe in that it's God's word is if it's a tricking God. And he says, well, what's simpler, a tricking God or no God at all? Now, let's take a minute and just look at Genesis, and hopefully this will be helpful. The difficulty with texts like Genesis, or anything in the Bible, is that this is an ancient book, and it was not written to you. It wasn't written to you or to me, and we approach it with questions and assumptions that we think it's going to answer this question or that question. And if it's not here to answer this question, but really that question, then we will misinterpret it. We approach this text with completely different questions from the people it was written to. If you go through this text, it goes down the list of Babylonian gods, and it uses Hebrew words like for sun, moon, water, and so forth, and it doesn't use the actual Hebrew word. It uses an alternative Hebrew word that was rarely used, but sounds a heck of a lot like the name for that god of Babylon, and it even includes some gods and things that were worshipped not by the Babylonians. In fact, every animal on the list was not a god in the Babylonian creation story. But the point is that what this text does is it takes all these things that were worshipped as gods and says that this other god made them. And that's really what it's doing. And so it's answering the question, should we worship the gods of other nations? We see this and we think, what is the natural history of how the earth came to be? And if you read it with that, then it's very odd. But if it wasn't written with that purpose, then it won't disagree, but it will leave out huge things that you would expect it to put in. But since it's not dealing with your question, it's dealing with the ancient question, it just leaves them out. For example, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Okay, at the beginning days of the earth, this was what it was like, according to science. I don't want to say that science is never wrong. It's a process of constant self-correction, so we shouldn't think that the science could be wrong. But this is, that Earth was this chaotic mass, lava, rock, even asteroids coming together, and just chaotic, forming, crushing, gravity just pressing it together. And there were clouds. It was dark. It says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and here waters would just mean it's the Babylonian god for chaos, the chaos god Marduk. It was a chaotic, orderless world. God said, "Let there be light." Again, he's referring to this other God, and it's from the reference point. It's not the creation of light itself. It's from the reference point of earth. What was it like on earth? Finally, there was light on the earth. In other words, the clouds dissipated to some degree. It said, and God separated the light from the darkness. And you see, that's the clue that this is from the reference point of earth, because there was, well, not necessarily, but that's not necessarily the clue, but again, this makes sense. It fits with science that when light broke the clouds, the earth would have been rotating and there would have been night and day. But there would not have been sun and moon, because that would require removing of even more clouds. Because light would have broke through before it broke through enough for you to recognize the sun and moon as separate, entities. It says, and God said, "Let there be expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse and waters that were above the expanse. It was so, and God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, there was morning, the second day. Okay? According to the science that we have today, somewhere in there, life originated. But the key to understand is that these ancient peoples did not worship invisible, microscopic, first life forms in a primordial sea. That was not an issue for them, that they would worship that. So this text would not address that. It would just skip over that, and it would go to the next thing that they worshipped as God, and it would say, this is when that was made by the real God. This is when that was made by the real God. Okay? And it says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, let dry land appear, creation of continents, again, formation of seas, water cycle, clouds, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then, so animal life in the seas could have easily been taking place, but they would not have worshipped the early animal life forms. They were all very small, and none of them would have existed for these, ancient Middle Eastern people, so they would not worship these things. But plants, they worship. Plants were the foundation of civilization, and we skip all the way to land plants, because they were key to these ancient peoples, and they did worship them. It says God made them. And then it says God made the sun and the moon, because they worship the sun and the moon. And from the natural history perspective, formation of plants on land would have radically altered the atmosphere, because they would have taken in the CO2 and critically changed what was going on Earth, and put out oxygen, and we'd have this oxygen-rich atmosphere with ozone layer and all these things, and you could see the sun and the moon. It says, let the waters swarm with living creatures. I mean, we've skipped over let birds fly above the earth. We've skipped over dinosaurs. We've skipped over all these things. It says let the waters swarm with living creatures. These were whales, dolphins, the mammals that really rule the sea were worshipped as gods. And he's saying those aren't gods. God made them. When it says living creatures, that's difficult to translate, but really it means animals, sea animals, mighty sea animals with the breath of life in them. And they worship birds. This is let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. Okay, so again, this does not include reptile life. This includes the creatures that they saw as the rulers of the land and gods. It lists three that that get lost in translation here. It says the beasts of the earth, in verse 25, the beasts of the earth, land carnivores, a word for land carnivore, chaya, and then livestock, behemoth, which they definitely worshipped because it was key to their existence, and then creeping things would have been their word for, that's how they describe rodents, also worshipped. So he's not going over every land animal, and this fits that, you know, the latest version of, you know, these land animals that they worshipped would have come later after these other things. And it says, let's make man in our own image. And this is key. This is a difference. This text has gone directly in the order that the Babylonian creation story went in, and it puts man at the end. So does the Babylonian story. But the difference with Genesis is that man comes at the end because there was this supreme God who had a plan. And it says that he started out with a chaotic world and slowly formed it and made it less chaotic, and until he got to man. And man was supposed to come in and finish, you know, God had made the world and it was good, and man was supposed to come in and tend to what God had made. And the interesting thing here is that this isn't the idea that, you know, the world, there was no problem or death or destruction. It is the opposite of what we find here, that the world was more messed up, and God started with a chaotic world and worked out his plan slowly, kept adding in things until he got to man, which is supposed to be the most important or most precious of his creation, most special. And there we go. Alright. See you, bye.